So today, we're going to dive into a story about a chain reaction of ideas and events that completely redrew the map of the 20th century. We're going to trace how some powerful, brand new ideas, born in 19th century Europe, eventually sparked the massive, earth-shattering Russian Revolution. And that really brings us to the core question we're going to be exploring. How can an idea, something that starts in a book or a debate, actually jump off the page, take root in the streets, and grow into a revolution powerful enough to topple an entire empire? That's the journey we're on today. All right, here's the plan. First, we'll set the scene with the age of social change right after the French Revolution. Then, we'll see how socialism emerges as this radical new idea. From there, we'll zoom in on the Russian Empire, which was a real pressure cooker of problems. Then, we hit the main event, the revolutions of 1917. After that, we'll look at how the Soviet state was built. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at its incredibly complicated legacy around the world. Okay, so where does this all kick off? Well, you've got to go back to the French Revolution. See, that event wasn't just about France. It sent shockwaves across all of Europe. It was this huge moment where people realized, whoa, we can actually tear down the old way of doing things. The entire social structure, the one dominated by kings and the church, suddenly seemed like it could be completely rebuilt. And that just opened the floodgates for all these new ideas about who should have rights and who should hold power. So in this new world of debate, you basically had three main groups wrestling for control. On one side, you had the liberals. Now, they wanted a country that was tolerant of all religions and had an elected parliament. But, and this is a big but, they weren't exactly Democrats. They thought only men with property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals. They went further. They wanted a government based on what the majority of people wanted, and a lot of them even supported women's right to vote. They were dead set against the privileges of rich landowners. And finally, you had the conservatives. They looked at the liberals and radicals and said, hold on, not so fast. They respected the past and believed if change was going to happen, it had to happen slowly, gradually. These three groups were just constantly battling it out. Now, all this political arguing wasn't happening in a bubble. It was a direct response to the Industrial Revolution, which was turning society upside down. Think about it. Suddenly, you have men, women, and even children pouring into factories. And the conditions? They were just awful. We're talking incredibly long hours, terrible wages, and the constant fear of being unemployed. Cities were exploding in size, but they were becoming these crowded places with disgusting housing and no proper sanitation. And the root of it all? Almost every single industry was private property, owned by individuals who, let's be honest, cared more about their profits than the people working for them. And all of that turmoil, that search for answers, it led to one of the most powerful ideas of the entire 19th century, socialism. This wasn't just about making a few small changes to the system. No, this was a completely different vision for how an entire society could work. And by the middle of the 1800s, this set of ideas was getting a lot of attention all across Europe. So what is socialism really? At its heart, socialists were against the whole idea of private property. They looked at the world and saw private property as the source of all of society's problems. Their logic went something like this. If an individual owns a factory, they're only focused on their own personal profit. They don't really care about the workers who are actually making the factory productive. So their solution was as simple as it was radical. What if society as a whole controlled all the property? Then decisions would be made for the good of everyone, not just a few rich owners. Now, the early socialists didn't all agree on exactly how to do this. You had guys like Robert Owen, an English manufacturer, who thought they could just build these model cooperative communities. He even tried to start one in America called New Harmony. But then you had others, like Louis Blanc in France, who thought that wasn't enough. He said governments themselves needed to step in and encourage cooperatives. Businesses where people work together and split the profits based on the work they did, so that they could eventually replace the old capitalist companies. But then Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came along and, well, they turned up the volume. They added a much more aggressive, revolutionary edge to socialism. Marx argued that industrial society was capitalist, and under capitalism, the workers could never get a fair shake because all the profits from their hard work were being hoarded by the private owners. His conclusion? The only way out was for the workers to rise up and violently overthrow the whole system. For Marx, this wasn't just an idea. He saw it as an unavoidable part of history that would lead to a communist society where everything was owned by everyone. Okay, so now let's shift gears. We're leaving Western Europe and heading east to Russia. Because while all these socialist ideas were buzzing around, the situation in Russia was different. In 1914, Russia was one of the least industrialized countries in Europe, and it was ruled by an autocrat, Tsar Nicholas II. This wasn't a democracy. The Tsar answered to no one. His power was absolute. And his empire was gigantic, stretching all the way from Finland to the Pacific Ocean, full of different religions and nationalities. And this chart, it tells you pretty much everything you need to know about Russia's economy back then. A whopping 85% of the people were farmers. Just to give you some perspective, in a place like France or Germany, that number was more like 40 or 50%. This massive reliance on agriculture created a totally different kind of society than you saw in the more industrial West. You might think the small number of industrial workers Russia did have were all one big, unhappy family, right? Well, not quite. The workers were actually a really divided group. Some had strong ties back to their villages, while others were lifelong city dwellers. And as this quote shows, they were also divided by skill. Metal workers literally thought of themselves as the aristocrats among the other workers. On top of that, women, who made up over 30% of the factory labor force, were paid way less than men. So this wasn't some unified group ready for revolution. And it wasn't just the workers who were different. The Russian peasants were a whole other story. Unlike in a place like France, where peasants might respect the local nobles, Russian peasants pretty much hated them. They refused to pay rent, and they believed the nobles' land should belong to them. And they had this really unique custom called the mir, or commune. They would periodically pool all their land together, and the commune would divide it up among the families based on their needs. This tradition of collective ownership made some socialists think that maybe the peasants, not the factory workers, were the true natural socialists who would lead Russia's revolution. So you have all this pressure building up, and in 1905, the whole thing just explodes. The year 1904 had been awful for workers. Their wages dropped by 20%, so they organized a peaceful march to the Tsar's Winter Palace to ask for help. They were met with gunfire. Over 100 people were killed. That event, Bloody Sunday, was the spark that lit the fuse. Strikes erupted everywhere. Universities closed down. Even professionals, like lawyers and doctors, started demanding a new government. The Tsar was so spooked that he finally gave in and allowed an elected parliament called the Duma. But he fired the first one after just 75 days, which kind of showed he wasn't serious about sharing power. And that brings us to the big one, 1917. This is the year the whole empire finally came crashing down. And what was the final push? The First World War. Russia joined the war in 1914, and at first, people were actually pretty supportive, rallying around the Tsar. But that feeling did not last. The war would stretch the fragile Russian state to its absolute breaking point. To put it bluntly, the war was a complete and utter catastrophe for Russia. They suffered humiliating defeats. By 1917, they lost over 7 million people. As the army retreated, they burned crops and buildings, creating 3 million refugees inside their own country. The German Navy blocked the Baltic Sea so industrial supplies couldn't get in. Able-bodied men were all sent to fight, creating massive labor shortages. And all the grain was being sent to the army, so in the cities there was no bread. By the winter of 1916, riots at bread shops were a daily thing. The war just totally destroyed any faith people had left in the Tsar. So the final collapse happened in 2 big waves. The first revolution hit in February. It started with women leading strikes in the capital, Petrograd, over bread shortages. When the soldiers were ordered to fire on the protesters, they refused and joined them instead. Just like that, the Tsar's power was gone. He had to abdicate. But the new provisional government made a huge mistake. They stayed in the war. This created a perfect opening for the most radical group, the Bolsheviks. After their leader, Vladimir Lenin, got back from exile in April, their popularity soared, and it all led to a second revolution in October, when they stormed in and took power for themselves. When Lenin got back in April, he didn't mess around. He laid out his plan in what's known as the April Theses, and his demands were incredibly simple and popular. Number 1, get out of the war now. Number 2, transfer all land to the peasants. And number 3, take over all the banks. These 3 promises, peace, land, and bread, were exactly what the soldiers, peasants, and workers were desperate to hear. So, the Bolsheviks are in charge. Now what? Well, now begins the massive, chaotic, and often brutal experiment of building the world's first socialist society. And the changes they made were immediate, they were sweeping, and they were designed to completely tear down the old world. So what changed? Right away, most industries and banks were nationalized. The government just took them over. Land was declared social property, which was code for peasants, go ahead and take the nobles' land. In the cities, they broke up large houses and divided them among families. They banned all the old aristocratic titles. The Bolshevik Party, which they renamed the Communist Party, became the only party allowed. And to make sure everyone stayed in line, they created a secret police, the Cheka, to punish anyone who dared to criticize them.
To drag Russia into the modern age, the Bolsheviks introduced these things called five-year plans. Basically, the government set huge targets for industrial growth. And you know what? It kind of worked. Just look at these numbers. Between 1929 and 1933, the production of oil, coal, and steel all shot up by 100%. New factory cities were popping up all over the place.
But what was it like for the people actually building all this? Well, this quote gives you a pretty brutal picture. Life was unbelievably hard. In these new factory cities, construction was so rushed that basic things like toilets were forgotten. The working conditions were terrible. Even though the government set up schools and some healthcare, the resources were stretched so thin that the results were really uneven. It was progress, but it came at a staggering human price.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What was the global impact of all this? The Bolsheviks' experiment didn't just stay inside Russia. It captured the imagination of people all over the world. It gave socialism a global face and created a legacy that is, to this day, both incredibly powerful and deeply complicated. And this really gets to the heart of the whole Soviet story. It's a story of contradictions. On the one hand, you can't deny the achievements. They took a totally backward country and turned it into a superpower. They built industries, they developed agriculture, they fed the poor. But on the other hand, this progress was built on a mountain of suffering. The government denied its people basic freedoms and used terrifyingly repressive policies. Millions died in man-made famines and were executed or sent to labor camps. By the end of the 20th century, even though the idea of socialism was still powerful, the reputation of the Soviet Union itself was completely destroyed.
And so we're left with this question, a really tough one. The Russian Revolution was born from these incredible ideals of equality and freedom. But in the messy, brutal reality of trying to build a new country from scratch, how much of that original vision actually survived? It's a question that we see again and again throughout history, and it's one that's still worth thinking about today. Thanks for joining this explainer.